what came to me is a question that felt rich and fertile was actually about questions themselves, and the healing potential of question. And I started, when I first started, we started conversing about this a bit with the myth of Percival. And when I spoke about it, you, Lonnie and Alexander, I think you both said you only knew the Monty Python version. But actually, I've spent a lot of time with the Arthurian legends because I think they're another really rich source of archetypal information. And the big piece that I had brought forward was this idea of Percival as the knight who'd been trying to heal this endless wounding of the Grail King. And the Grail King had an injury on his thigh that was festering and would not heal and was unhealable. And it continued to, even when it would begin to close, would open again. And that's really, in a way, the whole quest of the Grail legends, is how to heal this festering wound of the king. So you already can see this is where we're going. But Percival is the fool, really. He's the foolish knight. And he sees these knights in their shining armor when he's a boy, and he's like, I'm going to follow them. And his quest is this heroic quest. He's going to heal the king through heroism, to be the perfect knight. But it doesn't help. And nothing helps. And they keep failing and failing to heal the wound. And Percival's approaching the Grail Castle for the second, third, fourth time, every time he fails to heal the king. And on his way there, he's accosted by this, what they call the hideous damsel, Kundry. And Kundry just lays into him and says, you've been going out like this hero on your fancy horse, but really you just don't get it. You just don't get it. And finally, he just kind of collapses. And when he goes into the Grail Castle, and he's so broken, and he looks at the king, and he can suddenly feel to the depth of his soul the painfulness of this wound, the abjectness, but it smells, and it's painful, and it's oozing. And he looks at the king and he says, "O king, what ails thee?" And he asks that question from the place where the question needs to be asked, and the king is healed. That was what I wanted for us to look at. And then Lonnie, you were, so good, because you said, well, that's one of the sort of distinguishing features of Chinese medicine, is that we go in with questions rather than answers. And I would love to continue that as a dialogue for us. That was the question about the question. And I feel like for me, it's very present every day right now. How do we heal this wound?
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the most significant shifts in my life, really, which was the moment that I stopped using my intellect as a defensive mechanism, was when I realized not only that I didn't need to know, but that I didn't know, and that I'd probably never know. And what replaced all the knowing was just a very deep, profound interest in finding out and in looking into things. And it has impressed upon itself of, you know, on me time and time again that, you know, that there's a profound care being exercised through listening and through interest. And that profound care for me just gets to the very essence of who we are and why we're here. And that just asking from a place of real interest is very moving. And I've had people tell me, I've had people ask me this question before, or, someone said, what's disconcerting to me is that people always ask how I'm doing, but when you ask, you make eye contact and then you stop talking and you listen. And so there's just something to that, coming from a profound depth where there's a deep, deep existential, viscerally felt, authentic care to find out that just invites us to go somewhere together. It's mysterious.
Yeah, that's that's what's coming up for me too, Lonnie. I love the imagery and the story that you shared, Lorie, where there's this shift from a kind of certainty and heroism that then is replaced with sort of the recognition of a mystery.
Mm.
And I think that, I mean, one of the things that leads to our suffering is certainty. Whether it's like I'm certain that I'm a terrible person, or I'm certain that I'm stupid, or or I'm certain about this political perspective, or whatever it is. And the beauty of the question, well placed, it's like it's coming from a mystery, and so it also invokes the mystery. Um, Especially if it's a question that's asking beyond what someone is able to come up with given their current stuff, and it thrusts us into that vast night sky, or the that place of wonder. Yeah.
Yeah, the word interest is Lonnie is also kind of triggered the following thoughts here because that's what I perceive in the patient encounter as well, is that they're just the fact that you are looking at the patient or listening with genuine interest is all of a sudden changing the atmosphere in the clinic room, even if it, from just a question perspective, it could be, if you write it down, it could be perceived as small talk or so, but there is something that's deeply moving and opening there. Um, like the story that Lorie told about Parsifal, and it's this yeah, resolution of that process all started with a question in Chinese characters, right? To ask a question or a question itself is called Wen, and it's a door with a mouth underneath. So we're using our words to open a door, and standing in front of the door and not knowing, and there isn't really anything else we need to do is then to be present with genuine interest. And that alone is often so, I don't want to say strange, but touching for people because they're not used to that in their everyday lives, where everybody, including people in their own families, are everybody, it's just all, we living in this world where it's all about me, and everybody's pursuing their own, always being behind with time, and I need to do this, and how come this didn't happen? And if all of a sudden everything pauses and somebody is just being the container and without offering an answer necessarily, it's just like, I just want to be sitting here with you, and I'm truly interested in this, and I want to hear you speak from the central place in your heart is a liberation very often for people, long before you even get to inserting needles or prescribing herbs or so. So I felt like when Lonnie said the word interest, and Lorie was talking about Parsival and this opening, that's kind of what's coming up for me here. That is, yeah.
And I'm very aware as I'm listening here, and it really does feel like sacred to really be sitting here after all the listening. I'm aware of all the listening that the four of us have done for decades. So much listening. And I feel that listening present in the space. But I'm also very aware of that connection between the listening palace, between the small intestine's capacity for that kind of interest, and to discern what's actually being said or what actually needs to be asked. I guess that's more the question. It's like there's something about the discernment, because it's not just any question, it's the question. When Percival says, it's not just any question, it's the question. What ails thee? And we can say, and we know that even though this is from 1300, right? So the Grail trilogy, I mean, as we know, it comes from about 1300. So we know we're already at a time when consciousness is in a shift, and the ego or the self is becoming more defined. And in a sense, that king really is this question of, first of all, who is this king, and who is this king who is ailing already? What is it like? 800, 900 years ago. And the question, or that small intestine capacity to discern, and then how important that is, or necessary that is, in order for the heart to hear what needs to be heard in the space, in the room, or in the encounter.
What comes to mind here, Lorie, when you say that is that the heart before was the orifice of the heart being the tip of the tongue and our ability to speak. It was actually the ears. It was like in the Baihu Tong, it says like the ears are the orifice of the heart, and the process of listening is, that picture of listening is somebody who's holding their ears closed. So it's like you listen with your heart. Your heart is actually, and that comes back to your, what is the right question? We know this right here in the heart. And since the last point of the small intestine is called the palace of hearing, it's of course when we say the heart, it includes all the other 5 organs, including the small intestine. And its ability to discern that what of all the things we feel in our heart when we sit with the patient, what is the right question to ask? Because it's sometimes you are tired and you just go through the motions and nothing is happening. You come up with a prescription, all right, but there is not this sacred. And sometimes you just ask the right question and all, whether it's the tears are flowing or just some intimate space opens up where the patient then comes to some realization that's the medicine for them right there, just because the right question was being asked. And it wasn't even you asking that question. There was some kind of resonance field there. And but yeah, that's why I've been in a lot of conferences with Paul Unschuld, who's of course super respected in our field, but there is a certain, as a sinologist, there is a certain cynicism, right, with between academics who research things and then people who actually practice Chinese medicine. And Unschuld always comes from the place when he was lecturing that it was political circumstances that made the heart was first an earth organ and then it became a fire organ. And it was just because all of a sudden the Han are in charge and they have like a red banner and they wanted the heart to be fire. And so those kinds of things are always a bit cynical there when, I feel like this is all sage inside territory, how these things came into being at first. And when there's another layer or something, it's simply because there is another aspect, but the former aspect is still very much true. So the heart, the ears are indeed the orifice of the heart still, not just for the kidney.
Well, the small intestine is the closest official to the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And it came to me when you were talking, Lorie and Heiner. Heiner, you measured resonance, and in so many things, there's an inner and outer dimension. And in regards to asking, the outer dimension is the words that are said and the actual question itself, which can, of course, hit on the target anywhere from the periphery to the center of the bullseye. But there's also the place we're asking from. That's just beyond the words. It's the place we're listening from. And I think when that place is deeply rooted in the recognition of oneness and we're in this together and we're going somewhere together, when I'm really interested as a practitioner in what's really going on here, through resonance, the patient might get interested, as Alexander said, in rather than just looking into the script that they got from the last 48 therapists or wherever they've come to, being able to actually look into, well, what really is going on here? Just through resonance, because I'm interested, well, let's take a look at it. And it also, I think that, so the way I understand existence and the purpose of existence is that the material universe exists as the body for consciousness to be able to investigate the question, who am I? Which is the
say that again. Say that again. I got to take that
universe,
in. Say it
the material
slow.
universe is the body through which consciousness gets to incarnate into for the sake of asking the question and investigating, who am I?
Mm.
Which is the question of all, the root question, who am I? Who am I? And so when we ask someone what's going on, from a place of just being really interested in that, who am I? Who are you? Let's look into this together. It just creates the ground, a fresh ground and an invitation, perhaps, to be able to consider things new and frame things in a new way, in a way that is actually aligned with the motive force of becoming, the motive force of creation, that can be felt, that in my sincerity as a practitioner, in framing that question, there is love, there is care, and there is interest. I often translate the character Shen as interest,
Mm-hmm.
Shen's spirit as interest. That brightness we see in the eyes is interest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is something as a hunter, and there's the words, but then there's that resonance and an invitation into something that can be startling to people itself, regardless, I mean, the words are important, but maybe they're just the vehicle for something.
Yeah, it's like that cosmic fire forges this sacred gap, that's largely unique to human beings as far as we know, at least to the degree that we are exploring it. That gives us the ability to look and say, who am I? Like, a snail isn't, as far as we know, having that kind of conversation. And so it's like this cosmogenesis, this sort of this process of becoming that's been going on for so long. Finally, there's this illuminating fire that creates this gap that, causes so much suffering, but also everything else. And I think that, this notion of questioning, asking questions, it helps it helps us sort of consciously lean into that gap.
That's
And
beautiful, Alexandra. I love what you just said.
yeah. And the other thing that occurs to me, in addition to what Lonnie was saying about like where are we asking from, I notice sometimes, clients will be in a kind of a default mode in terms of where is their inquiry coming from? And so as this conversation has been unfolding, it's like, so I'm there in the sacred gap with my client, and I ask them a question, and they start answering the question, but they're answering the question from a disembodied place. And then if I say, oh yeah, what I'm curious, what happens, like, what's that same question, but from here, if you were to do, and then all of a sudden, they're weeping because there's where I'm asking the question from, but there's where are they listening to in themselves, and
Mhm.
where are they dropping the question into,
Yes.
Mhm.
and that makes a huge difference. And um, in terms of what material sort of maybe is not the right word, what arises, from that question.
Yeah, I mean, in answering, the person is telling us who they think they are in that moment and what dimension of themselves they're identifying with and its opinion of who they are and how they are. And of course, all of that can be understood in a developmental context. And as that, you know, I mean, enlightenment is just can be a trillionth of a degree shift of perspective. And so Alexander just points out, when you mentioned, well, what if you ask that same question, but through different eyes or through a different part of the self? And that really relates to a shift of perspective, which can be instantaneous.
Mhm.
Because there are many voices in our head with many opinions.
Yeah. You'll say, how are you? And they say, oh, I'm fine. I'm doing really great. I'm doing so great. I'm just curious, uh, if you were to check in with your heart, how are you? And then
Mhm.
there's a whole other world. Hey, if you check in with your soul, how are you?
In general, this topic is so interesting on the second day of entering into the year of the fire horse, because we keep coming back. Not just the questioning has to do with listening, and listening has to do with listening from the heart and querying from the heart. But what Lonnie just said about resonance and what is the purpose of the body in this process as a whole, of the body as a resonance vessel with the heart being the center of that.
Yes.
I was just thinking when Lonnie mentioned that the Chinese character for body, there are several ones, but the most important one is Ti. And that is the same character as Li originally, which is the virtue, the name of the virtue for the heart.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And the virtue, which means the powers that functions we have stored in the organs, stuff like trust and wisdom and compassion, we can sort of understand, but the central virtue of what is Li is usually translated as ritual, but then it seems like this boring kind of thing that we as modern people not really feel drawn toward, when Li is really exactly what we're talking about, which is this ability to see the sacredness and what is really important behind the material world, how the material world is a manifestation, and that's what is sacred, that it is not just like plastic or so, is has a function. So there's food and you can eat it, and there's a plate and a fork, so you can, but that there is every substance starting with a stone or so is radiating, is carrying an energy and radiating and pointing back at the consciousness that created it in the first place. And that then creates meaning and purpose, because, like, the word for meaning in German is bedeuten, which means it points at something. So I think that, and so all of a sudden the physical world is more than just material stuff, which is slaying us because it's, you need to pay money for it, it breaks, but it is we living in this. Nature is a sacred vessel, and our body is a sacred vessel. Like, literally, the character T and Lee is a picture of a vessel that you hold up to the sky. So, as Lonnie was saying, I think I heard you say that there is this, what is evolution is, there's things, and then there are things that can self-reproduce, and then there are things they run and eat and reproduce, and then there are things that go beyond that we call the human being, which is always considered the most precious because of that function in the ancient classics, because we starting not just going like, how do I sustain this body with eating and running, but what is the purpose of it all? Why am I here? And the very first characters that were created, they weren't there to buy something, but they were held back to the sky. Meaning, you give us light, and I'm drawing this light, and I give it back to you because I recognize that this is a sacred thing. So it's creating resonance, and then conscious realization, and returning the light and returning the gesture. And so that is Li, that is ritual, that's living a sacred life with, and that if we using our body, particularly our heart, as a vessel for resonance, where we then also merging with that energy field of the patient, then be able to ask the right question and elicit a similar kind of response there.
One thing that came to my mind while you were talking goes back to what you had said earlier about the character one, which is the character men. for gate with mouth under it. And then I thought of the relationship with Ming Men, also gate of destiny. And the relation, when we ask this question, who are you? We're really evoking the soul's curriculum and their relationship to it, which can exist on a continuum from totally unaware to having an inkling to full out manifestation. And so there's something evocative, in asking through resonance to start addressing, to engage that portal of all portals, the portal, between being and becoming and manifestation and who am I? Why am I here? How shall I live? Those kind of questions. And their relationship to the individual destiny, which is ultimately, collective. We're there with the patient, sharing in that.
It seems like the image of the door comes back in various characters and questions as a door. And I've always, in my own way of how my imagination works, I always have thought about the small intestine, like my visioning, my metaphor is always that the small intestine, I always see the small intestine sitting like at this desk, right at the doorway to the heart's chamber. It's forever, I've seen it that way. And it's like, how the minister sits at the desk and they bring all the correspondence. There's probably some mix up of something JR said or whatever, but it's been like, so they bring, this huge basket of entreaties and questions and business that the heart had, and the small intestine sits there and has like, okay, this goes in, this does not, this piece. And it's like a sorting process that happens there. And then when when the small intestine knows what the heart actually needs to have its attention on, then the door opens and this message is delivered, or the messages. So I'm really liking the idea of the question that is the healing question opens the door. It's the question that opens the door. But it also, as you're saying, Heiner, has to be of the heart's vibration. Oh, so it's almost like the small intestine is listening at the door also, so that it knows what the heart actually needs to hear or see. And I also struck, Heiner, by something that you said earlier about how sometimes you're sitting there in the room with somebody and you're just like, it's just like noise, or they're talking, but none of it's making a lot of sense. And you're sitting there. And when that happens now, for me, I know that something is actually pregnant. Like, even though it seems like it's not, it is. And that if we can shift that into a reverie state, just relax into it, amazing things will come through. Like you said, you don't expect, you think, oh, I'm just in this. And then you stop trying, almost letting it wash over. but I think there's a listening there. That's what I'm getting at as I sit with this, that even though we're in a reverie or we're in this, that the small intestine's still listening to discern what's really coming. And it comes, it does, like some of the most amazing moments for me with the patient will come then when I feel like, oh my, I'm like I'm just like being bombarded or overwhelmed and I can't even. And then I lean back and then it's like it comes out of that. That the coalescing of the question.
Well, there's a level of listening to. I mean, often I have the experience in clinic where I ask a question that's totally unpremeditated, and I'm hearing myself ask it, and then standing back and watching the entire dynamic that ensues out of interest. So what's asking is what's listening.
Mm-hmm.
When there's oneness, and it's like playing music, like in those rare moments, because I'm not a great jazz guitarist, but in those rare moments where like I play something and the band shifts, I'm I have to, oh, I just played that phrase. I have to now in the next moment respond to the phrase that I just played, which was spontaneous, without letting thought get in the way. And
Right.
it's very much the same kind of thing clinically. I mean, we can go through how old are you? Where were you born? Are your parents alive? How is there? There are those level questions. And then there are the questions that I've asked that have always surprised me, that then draw me into having to stand back from the whole process creatively, see what comes, and then go somewhere. And it's improvisation. It's a flow. And to be able to, at that point, you're sort of in the river, in the currents, navigating and not totally you're not in control. And that to me is sort of the thrilling place.
Well, I think too, it's like that in a way, there's a way that we can be with our clients where we're actually inviting an intersubjective dialogue, a co-emergence. I used to supervise students at an acupuncture school in Colorado, and I'd often see it's like they're sitting, in their chair, and the patient is sitting in their chair, and the the student will like ask a question as if they're like throwing a question across the room from a distant land, like, how is your, sleep? You know, and and it's like, well, actually, the main event here is the quality of connection. That, I remember I learned this from Thea Elijah, where, she's like, well, you can ask someone about their urination, like, what is your urination like? And it's like, what is your sleep like? How's your digestion? So tell me about your relationship to jazz. That that there can be an invitation into a certain kind of dialogue where then you're no longer an interviewer. You're surfing together.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yes.
right, your question, it's like Lonnie was saying, like if I say the same thing, similar thing that Lonnie said, but in the context of like a client practitioner, it's like I ask a question and then the whole thing changes, which then brings up the next question, and then they say their thing, and there's like a surfing at the edge, like I don't know where this is going to go. And then we're really at the edges of that mystery. That's where I'm like like what I enjoy a lot at the end of a session when the client says something like, well, I had no idea we were going to go
I knew you
there,
were going to say that. I knew
you
you were
know?
going to say that,
And it's
right?
like, that's always a sign to me that we did something, because
Yeah.
it's like, of course, we fell off the cliff into the sacred gap, and like, you know, our heart turned into like daffodils on the way unexpectedly. Yeah.
And and I feel like we're kind of getting at the big question for me around the myth, which is what why this particular motif, which really shows up again and again. And so we keep coming back to, okay, if we're dealing with consciousness at the shift between mythical consciousness, I'm going to just geek out a little bit here, where, we're in that gap is not so, it's more relational. There's something more relational. The ego hasn't cohered in the way it began to around 1500. But the problem that the myth talks about, where the shift between Percival as, the armored knight, just, yes, he's a fool, but still he's got his armor and he's got his horse and he's on his mission to Kundry, really, I mean, she slays him in the myth. She just slays him. So he's face to face with his own abjection and he failed. He failed to save the king. He failed to heal the wound. And she just takes him to that place. I mean, she literally rides in on a donkey. She's a pig snout, This is my postal. Like, she's perfect. Her hair is a mess, and she just like, she says, "You're no knight. You're just, look at you." And then he goes through this big transformation, and he can ask the healing question. But what I got, Alexander, because I mean, I sit with this a lot. This is a myth that I really think about. What you said, what I got is that he's not asking the question like I'm throwing the dart across the room. What the hell ails you, King? What's wrong with you? Yeah. It's like we're in this together. Like she brought, maybe it's that myth of like some capacity arises in him through this encounter, whether you call it an internal or an external encounter, doesn't matter. He encounters a kind of breaking apart of who he's thought he was, which is so painful. And like facing our objection together allows for him to ask the question as if he's part of the question, and that's, I think, what I got listening to Alexander. I was like, oh, that's what's happening here.
Yeah, and as you're speaking, what's happening to me is, it's like I feel like as you're bringing this imagery of this like mad woman like on a donkey and like just cutting through all this stuff, I feel like it's like I'm being dropped deeper and deeper into a sense of innocence. Like there's a nakedness, a nakedness and an innocence that's occurring within wholeness. So it's not like a deficiency, but it's like everything is being cut away. And then all that's left is this, like, all you could ask is the most innocent question. That's the question that just gets to the heart of the whole thing. And you don't even know that's what it's going to do. It's not like you have a list of good questions anymore. You're just like, what do you need? But it's coming from a place. And then the whole thing just kind of opens.
The spell is broken in the myth, the spell.
The spell is broken.
Yeah, it's interesting because patients want us to be the one who knows. And I often found it very effective when a patient would speak a while and then they'd look at me and say, "What do you think?" And I found one of the most effective answers would be to look at them and say, "Well, having heard yourself say all that, what do you think?" And sometimes people don't get it, but very often give them an opportunity to stand back and see themselves as if they had been standing outside watching it. And then we can get a perspective of really a fair amount of time of their own witness on their own process. People would always ask me, what are these points going to do? And I would always say, it's much better for you to come back and tell me what they did. So there's just something like, this invitation into a mystery, this deep invitation into it. And a question, introducing the person to their own capacity to question and to see and witness who they are and what they are is a very, we can ask so the question I asked is, what do you think of it? Just turns it back, can take it to a deeper level where the person can get in touch with their own authority or their own inner interest.
Yeah, that brings to mind, Lonnie, the in a certain way, that was other than the characters themselves, what the Chinese did first as an utterance, their first written utterance of their culture was the I Ching, right? The book of change, but it was apart from being a cosmology math book, really to categorize the phenomena of the world into 64 different energetic combinations. It's a tool to ask questions, right? What's the heck is going on? I don't know. Show me what's happening. And you have this elaborate process of the yarrow sticks that is so much more complicated than throwing coins. And then, of course, you often don't know what question to ask. So just kind of going through the process of washing your hands as you're supposed to, of lighting the incense, of focusing on how do I ask the question already gets answered. And so in a certain way, that's what Lonnie was just saying, was reminding me of this kind of just giving the patient an opportunity to speak gives clarity that without answering the question, it's already been answered just through that process of asking the question or preparing or doing it in a particular ritualistic way, which technically the visit at the doctor's is that sacred space. It's you drive, you go there, you take a vacation for half a day from your job. It's a special time. So yeah.
But that brings up ritual again and its relationship to the heart, the propriety of the heart, and the activation of the heart and interest. I remember trying to do the yarrow stalks when I was 13. It was about all I could handle, but it takes you out of your mind. You're paying attention to that, and it creates, you can sit down. I mean, now you don't even have to throw coins. You can press your computer mouse and get an hexagram.
But people actually say, "Oh, it's pretty good." I'm like,
but there is something, isn't there, to sitting there and doing that ritual with the stalks, and you've asked a question, but now you're just trying to pay attention, and you're letting go, you're letting go, you're letting go. And the ritual itself is, it's creating that possibility for the presence of Shen, the presence of Ling, the soul, the mystery, the luminous mystery to happen. And then, with the I Ching, we get in touch with this intelligence, this vast intelligence, this intersubjective intelligence, which is speaking to us from beyond, which is us, which we've come to realize through evolution we're not separate from. And I think there is something to this, the ritual form of treatment that creates the space when we ask a question sincerely for, again, for this to take us to the heart of, I'm not the one who knows here, working on you with techniques. We are traveling together in a mystery that we can be very interested in and open and receptive to. And I think, it's that receptivity that creates the space for the miraculous.
Yeah. Well, and what's occurring to me, it's like the role of myth and the role of theater, like where people like they step into a role, they play through this tragedy or whatever it is. And what occurs to me as I'm listening is like one of the greatest forms of suffering, I think, is when we forget that we're part of this sacred myth of separation. It's like we're not, like so many clients come in and it's like the sort of the assumption is as soon as I don't have all the bad feelings, then we will have gotten to the way things are supposed to be,
Mm-hmm.
and everything will be okay then. So
Right.
if you would please get going and help me figure out how to experience what I think it's supposed to be, what this place is supposed to be like, where I don't have problems. When actually it's like that doesn't seem to be what this place is for at all. We're in this sacred unfolding story that has trials and tribulations and chaos and uncertainty and ambiguity and discovery and mystery and insight. And as I'm listening to what everyone is saying, it's like part of asking a good question. It's like asking the client to wake up to the fact that we're in a like a sacred myth that we're co-creating together. And it
Yes.
is going to have skinned knees and like we're going to have crushed bones sometimes and we're going to wail and all that stuff. That's not like an error. That's part of the thing that we're learning how to lean into. And I think there's something about the difference between forgetting that we're doing that, then we're just overcome with all the ouchies, and we forget that it's meaningful. And I think there's something about a question, a good question asked in the right way, that it pops us out. And then we're like, oh, like the question, what's the positive impact of all your agony? Like, what does that do? What does
Mhm.
that provoke? What is the gift
Mhm.
within
Absolutely.
that really difficult conversation that you were just in and saying you wish never happened? What is the gift? It all of a sudden it pops us into a new place from which we're participating.
But as I'm listening to you, I'm very aware. I'm really aware as I'm listening that you could say to somebody, well, what's the gift of this fact that, you're going to have to get a new hip? Just
Yeah.
say, you could say that. And I could be your patient and say, that is the most obnoxious thing.
Yes.
Just, I don't even want to hear that
Well,
right
getting
now.
a new hip is always good. Yeah. It's, but we can go.
Wait, let me finish here. So, but the thing is, what I'm really getting as I'm playing this through and listening to is you could ask me that in another way
Right.
where it would open up my whole story.
Mhm.
So, what's the distinction?
Right.
And what I got as I was listening to you, Alexander, is the distinction. I know you said this already, Lonnie, but I'm really getting it. Is the distinction is that I feel like you really care.
Mm.
Right.
Like you're not just being like asking me some dumb new age question.
Right.
but that you are with, and it comes back to that thing about Percival. It's like you're with me here
Right.
in this place of insane, ridiculous things that happen to us in these bodies. And I think that's the objection that Kundry brings Percival to. Get off your horse, get out of your armor, and get down here with humans and their stinking wounds and care about it. And that breaks the spell.
Well, part of it is getting into it. I'm laughing. I have to tell the story. So like like about 20 years ago, I was just starting to study with Lonnie, right? And I was like, oh, this like fierce gusto of like, infinite positivity. And like I had never like seen Lonnie in a session with a patient, right? I'm just like taking in these things. And I'm sitting with a client and she's telling me this really intense stuff. And I hadn't really touched a significant amount of my own anguish by that point in my life, like some, but not a lot. And so I asked a question like that, like something about how she's infinitely positive. It's like I was trying on my teachers, right? And this person literally stood up, stormed out of the room, and then like walked around in circles for about like 10 minutes, and then like came back and they were like, you are either absolutely right or you are totally bypassing all of your shadow. And I think part of the thing was I was asking probably at that time the quote unquote right question, but I hadn't been like slain. I hadn't touched my own agony yet, so it resonated from a true infinite positivity,
Mhm.
but not an infinite positivity that had sufficiently gone through the belly of like, screeching whales,
Yeah, that's really beautiful,
I didn't
Alexander.
tell you
And
to
the
ask a
irony is, of
question like
course, it
that,
was the
did I?
right question
No,
because she
no,
turned around and around and around and came back in. She
yeah,
didn't leave.
she didn't leave. I mean, it was like, what is this little whippersnapper up like all about? Like, did you not just hear what I said? Like there was a lack of skillfulness
Hmm.
and a lot of good intentions and
Yeah.
trying to emulate what I thought I was hearing, but without having gone through, there has to be the slaying.
Right. You hadn't met Kundry yet.
Well, the third possibility was both the things she said were true simultaneously,
Yeah.
Right, which was. I think
which
that's
was,
actually what was
yeah,
that was it.
that's right.
Yeah.
The everything that you guys just said, I got the following thought about the nature of questioning, and Lonnie brought up the word ritual again. It what makes the I Ching, for instance, the asking questions there a ritual in addition to the rigmarole with the external things is and Lonnie also used the word sincerity, is you ask with sincerity and then you follow the answer. So that
Mm.
is a very important, intricate part because there are different kinds of questions. There are questions that we often ask the patient to elicit information, but Lonnie mentioned this very good point of the patient asking us about what should I do, or and Lorie mentioned the dumb new age question or something, and probably more from students or something like that. I remember when, like, my favorite I Ching to use is the Jiao Shi Yilin Master Jiao's um, I Ching forest or so, right? Because there were already so many in the second century BC, so many different interpretations of, you get this hexagram and it moves to this one. I don't know. I can maybe understand the first answer, but then how I integrate that with the second one is too difficult. So there was this monumental project of writing 4,096 poems by Jiao Yanshou, I think his name was, to give only one answer in 64 chapters with 64 subchapters. that integrates, hexagram one turning into itself, hexagram one turning into two, hexagram one turning into three. And it's crystal clear, right? Like you are, what's the big yes is I go into the forest and the yellow emperor comes down and picks me up and puts me on his dragon chariot and we ride into the sunset. And negative would be I'm visiting home and I'm halfway up the hill and I turn around and my house is on fire and that kind of thing. There's no room for interpretation here. And this was introduced to me by Liu Hong many years ago. And he always cautioned, he said, do not ask a question unless you're ready to follow the answer. Otherwise, you're going to get gobbledygook answers because you didn't ask sincerely, you didn't ask from a ritual place. So I very rarely consult the I Ching because I'm first go like, in the worst case scenario, if this is something that my ego doesn't like, am I willing to follow that? Because it's in a certain way, the universal consciousness is my master, and I'm putting sincerely this question. If I constantly ask frivolously, and then I never follow the advice or the reading I'm getting, then it is sort of like what Lorie was saying, or what sometimes literally Chinese teachers will do, that when student asks a question and they won't answer, they completely ignore, and then I'm going like, Shifu, why this was kind of rude, we don't. He says that it's 对牛弹琴 is like playing the chin to the oxen or so, because they're not going to follow this advice anyway. You spent this energy there. So that is always the
Yes.
kind of that was kind of a deep learning for me, this kind of be careful with your questions,
Yeah.
because if you really want serious advice, you need to ask seriously and be willing to follow that advice.
Well, it's a sign of disrespect, you know. And these are powerful methods and there are powerful medicines, but when we don't take them seriously or approach them sincerely, things I do think can get distorted. I have noticed patients or students on occasion asking me questions, and I know as they're asking, they know the answer I'm going to give, and they're praying to get a different one. They're really hoping they know what I'm going to say, but they don't want to hear it. And they already know the answer, and they're just hoping that I'll say something else. And sometimes I'll say to them, you know what I'm going to say, right? And they'll say, yeah, but that's not what I want to hear. The one of the things I've discovered in my own life is nobody has absolute free will, and most of us don't have much free will, but we all know a lot more about what we're up to than we're willing to admit to ourselves. But I am brought into as we've gone through this, just sort of the sacredness in the opportunity of having the opportunity to ask a question. And the Bodhisattva vow says, may no interaction be insignificant, which comes from the recognition that, all we have is this moment. It's delusional to take any other future moment for granted. So in this moment, if this is the only moment, what is the question that I can most deeply and sincerely ask, and then open myself with infinite interest in receptivity to what comes into that space, which is sacred,
I feel like that's one of the biggest, I would say, really landing for me in this conversation. I feel very much like this idea of virtue or Lee, and that the question, I keep seeing the image of the vase of flowers on the altar, that to really hold that when we ask a question in this way, that we are really making an offering, that it really is an offering, and how important it is also to make a space around the question. You know, like I forget, somebody said to follow the question, to follow what comes, but also, like, I'm thinking of my own experiences with the practitioner, like when that amazing thing happens where I feel like I know myself differently now. It's often because the question is asked, but then there's the space for that ephemeral arrival that's neither the patient or the practitioner. That's we've made a space, we've made an offering, and then the third or the spirit can enter into the space. That's really what the healing question is, an invitation, an offering.
There's humility in that.
Yeah, there is indeed that. There are certain teachers in China, you invite them to give a lecture and then they come and then they just ask me some questions, but it's just the energy in the room is completely different based on, because it's sort of an elicitation of, I want to see how serious you all are and how you get the seriousness. Coming back to Lonnie's comment that this is a Dao Chang, this is a sacred place and a sacred moment, and we, in some ways, all we have. Let's make the best out of this. And you can see, I remember the my wife is part of a group that is supporting immigrants in Portland by kind of having going to somebody's house, and they invite like every month like somebody from Peru or Syria or so to make food, and then you donate something that goes directly to that family, but it's also then that person gets to tell their story, how they get there, and you have about between 15 and 25 people participating. I only participated once, but it's this at the end, everybody gets to ask questions, right? And so here's this person who went through hell to be there and has this amazing story to tell. And some people, they ask a question that, coming back to this word respect that Lonnie was saying, that is kind of honoring just this moment that we all together and the kind of gravity of the moment and the kind of respect for what this person went through, including the excellency of the food. But then some people ask the most frivolous question where you almost want to crawl underneath the table and you feel embarrassed because you are in the space. You feel almost, even though you're not asking the question, but uh, that was kind of came up for me when we were talking just now. So it is different questions are they are can open or close doors,
Yeah.
and yeah.
As you're speaking, the feeling that comes up for me is this sense of like, when we're asking a question, it's like we're like drawing out this like depth of beauty that's in someone, whether it's inviting them to tell tell their story, share what their movements, through life have been. And there's a way that good questions, they're like a calling out, and sometimes too, it's like that gap between what's living in my heart and what is articulated through my speech. Sometimes there's a big gap there, or there's things living in my heart that maybe I don't even know are there because they haven't really taken shape. They're living in kind of an undifferentiated sort of yin
Mm.
kind of ocean. And then the right questions, all of a sudden it's like it gets articulated through this generative power of language. And all of a sudden the whole world is coming out of someone because they weren't asked the frivolous question. They were asked a question where they all of a sudden, we've all experienced this. The clients will say, "Oh, well, I didn't realize any of this stuff was in me. I didn't know I felt this way. I didn't know I thought about that." And there's something so powerful about that connection between the heart and speech, and how that sort of undifferentiated sensation becomes a world,
Yes.
takes shape through a good question. It's like, as you were speaking, Heiner, it was like this. I was sort of imagining the gathering you were describing, and I was like imagining the person who was hosting and some, deep human being who's lived and hurt and all this stuff, and just this feeling of like a drawing out or a coaxing out of their sacred story, beauty.
And asking questions, I mean, I think this relates to what you said, maybe a different face of it. You know, people people come to acupuncture and Chinese medicine for all varieties of reasons. And when we start asking questions of depth, very often people say, I had no idea that I could talk about this here,
Right.
or that Chinese
So
medicine
often,
could
yeah.
could address this just because of the nature of the questions we're asking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It
I
for
mean,
me,
I really encourage, it's one of the things that I'll talk about is if we draw the circle, the patient will go to those edges. If we don't draw the circle, the patient's going to stay in what they think the circle is. And the questions that we ask are very much part of drawing the circle. I really totally agree with that, Lonnie. People, they're like, oh, you mean it's that big? And how exciting that inevitably is. It's such a amazing that is a wonderful moment, I think, with a new patient. It's like, oh, you're asking about that.
I always remember a patient who was telling me about the unfortunate circumstances of her marriage. And in the middle of it, she just said, I just want more depth. And I let a space and then I said, well, how much more depth do you want? Do you want a little more depth or do you want access to infinite depth? And it totally took her back. She almost gasped. She was a psychoanalyst. And that question changed her life. Like everything came out of that question and things, she went through a process, but every now and then I'll be in Boston and I'll meet her on the street. And whoever she's with, she'll introduce me and say, he saved my life. And I'll always say, I helped you save your life. Nobody can save another person's life. You save, not at this level, you saved your life. But it always comes back to that question. because it helped frame for her. She thought of herself as wanting more depth, but as soon as I presented the opportunity to have infinite depth, she could feel the contraction back. And then had to stop projecting her lack of depth on her partner and rather see actually within myself. I think of myself as a person who wants depth, but when faced with the ultimacy of it, that's just too much. And then she could take responsibility for the whole thing and stop projecting that on her husband. We have a few minutes left. Would anyone like to take us out?
I think you already took us out there with that last story and remark. I think that was a good end note there.
It's beautiful to be all together.
Yeah, sure is.
I love you guys, and it's just fabulous.
Yeah, I thank you so much for opening to the question about the question.
Well, thank you to all our listeners, and we'll be back at the next installment.